Hey everyone, welcome to this deep dive on Petra. I bet you guys are probably already picturing those iconic rock-cut facades, but today we're
Yeah.
gonna go way beyond that touristy imagery.
We're gonna go deep, like 200,000 years of history deep. We'll be talking about a delicate ecosystem and the modern day struggle to keep it all in balance, stuff that's happening right now.
And all of that we're gonna get from just a couple sources, right?
Yep. Excerpts from a really cool academic case study on sustainable tourism, plus a few quotes from the Petra National Trust website.
Nice. Okay, so imagine this. Pre-pandemic, Petra was seeing over 1 million visitors each year. That just blows my mind.
Yeah.
How do you even start to manage that many people while making sure the site isn't, like, crumbling under the pressure?
Yeah, it's the million-dollar question. And to really get it, we kind of have to take a step back in time.
Oh, a history lesson.
It's not like that, I promise. It's actually pretty fascinating.
Okay, you've got my attention. Let's hear about that deep time stuff.
So there's actual evidence of humans being in this area around Petra for over 200,000 years. We're talking Paleolithic campsites up in those surrounding hills. And they even found traces of like the seasonal village that was set up north of the site about 13,000 years ago. Crazy, right?
I know. Makes you think about, like, how much history is under our feet when we go to these places. But those facades, the ones everybody knows, they came much later, yeah?
Oh, yeah. Those are thanks to the Nabateans. They set up their capital in Petra sometime between the 4th century BCE and the 1st century CE. And get this, these guys weren't just amazing artists, and architects, but they were total master engineers too.
You mean the city carved into rock thing wasn't enough? What else did they do?
They built this super intricate water system. It's a whole network of dams and cisterns and aqueducts. That's what let them flourish in this like crazy dry place.
Wow, they were changing their environment that long ago. That's wild.
Right. It's like the Petra National Trust website says it's a spot where nature and man have joined to create this extraordinary phenomenon.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to describe it.
And they go on to say that Petra is a dramatic testament to the art, wealth, and technological skills shared between great ancient civilizations. Which makes you wonder, how much of what they knew back then have we just lost, like forgotten over time?
Totally. We tend to see these old civilizations through the lens of, their big monuments. But there's got to be so much more to their story.
Exactly. And speaking of stories, Petra's didn't end with the Nabateans. Just like so many ancient cities, empires changed, new powers popped up.
Right.
The Romans came along in 106 CE. Petra became a part of their Arabia province. And even later, when the Roman Empire moved its capital over to Byzantium, Petra still stayed an important center.
Huh. So it wasn't just a blip on the radar. Petra stayed important for a long time, even under different rulers. But it did eventually decline, right?
Yeah. It did. Trade routes changed, and Petra just kind of faded. By the 7th century, with Islam rising and more shifts in trade, the city was mostly abandoned. And it pretty much disappeared from like Western knowledge until that Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt came across it in 1812.
Whoa, a lost city rediscovered. That's like straight out an adventure book.
Uh-huh.
But I have this feeling that while that rediscovery was amazing, it also kind of set the stage for the problems Petra's facing today.
You're right on the money with that. Because with that rediscovery, Petra started a whole new chapter. One with archaeological digs and preservation efforts and, well, tourism.
And that's where things get really interesting and complicated, I bet. Like, what happens when a place that was lost for hundreds of years is suddenly a world-famous spot?
And that's what we're going to dive into next. Get ready, because we're about to explore this whole balancing act of keeping the past alive while handling everything the present throws at it. So we've got this incredible city, like, plopped right into the modern world, and now over 1 million people want to see it every year. I'm sure you can imagine that managing that many tourists and keeping the place from falling apart is a pretty tough gig.
You think? Who is even in charge of trying to keep all that in check?
Well, there are a few key players here. First off, you've got the Petra Development and Tourism Regional Authority. They go by PDTRA. They were set up in 2009, and they're responsible for the whole region around Petra. It's a huge area, something like 755 square kilometers, and that includes the Petra Archaeological Park, which is specifically focused on the ancient city.
So PDTRA is like the big picture folks, and the archaeological part people are the ones actually there
Yeah.
dealing with the site and all the tourists every day.
Exactly. And then there's the Petra National Trust, PNT. That's Jordan's big non-governmental organization, and they're dedicated to protecting the country's cultural heritage with a special focus on Petra. Oh, and they're also a full member of the International National Trusts Organization, so they're pretty well connected globally.
Okay, so you've got the government agency, PDTRA, and this NGO, PNT. Are they working together, or is it more of a, I don't know, a headbutting situation?
That's a good question, and honestly, it's a bit of both. They both want to protect Petra, obviously, but they often have different ideas about how to do it. And the case study really digs into that tension, especially when you talk about balancing tourism and conservation.
You mentioned a major problem is this over-reliance on tourism. Can you explain that a bit more? Like, what are the downsides besides just wearing down the site?
It makes the whole region super vulnerable.
Hmm.
Think back to those examples we talked about earlier. The first Gulf War, the Arab Spring uprisings, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Every single one of those had a huge impact on international travel. And since Petra's economy is so tied to tourism, it hit them really hard.
It's like they're putting all their eggs in one very fragile basket.
Exactly. And what's even more worrying is that this case study suggests that the Jordanian government's policies actually make this problem worse. They're so focused on getting those visitor numbers up, boosting tourism, that they sometimes forget about the long-term health of Petra and the people who live there.
Wow, that's a pretty serious claim. What kind of policies are we talking about here?
Well, for instance, businesses in the tourism industry get tax breaks and incentives, but there's not as much support for things like conservation efforts or helping the local economy become more diverse. And that creates this constant pressure to bring in more and more tourists, even if it means putting more strain on the site and the environment around it.
I see. It's all connected, isn't it? You can't just talk about protecting the ruins without looking at the economics and the government's role in shaping all that.
Exactly. And that's where the Petra National Trust really steps in. They're pushing back against those policies and arguing for a more balanced approach. One of the key lessons they've learned, and they talk about this in the study, is how important it is to give a voice to the folks who don't have as much power in this whole situation.
So you mean not just the big government agencies and the huge tourism companies, but the actual people who live and work in and around Petra?
Exactly. They're the ones who are most affected by all these decisions, but they often have the least say in what happens. The PNT is trying to change that.
How are they doing that?
They've got their hands in all kinds of projects to preserve Petra. Everything from archaeological digs to restoration to working with the community. And one thing that really struck me was what they did during the first Gulf War when tourism completely stopped. They used that time to excavate a Nabatean workshop complex in the Zaraba area, and they made sure to hire local people for the project.
Oh, wow. So they were providing much-needed jobs during a time when everything was shut down, and they were also learning more about Petra's history. That's incredible.
Right. It shows how they're not just about preserving the past, they're trying to make a positive impact on the community today.
What other kinds of projects have they been involved in?
Well, their restoration work is amazing. They restored the original floor and slope of the the main entrance to the city. And they even built a dam there to help with those flash floods.
Flash floods, I wouldn't have thought that'd be an issue in such a dry place.
It's actually a big problem, and it ties back to what we were saying before about everything being interconnected. The PNT has done tons of research on the water systems in the sick. They even published a whole book about it.
So they're not just doing the hands-on work, they're also adding to our scientific knowledge about the site. That's really impressive.
Oh, yeah. And they've been working to preserve some incredible paintings in Sikal Barid. Those were in danger of being lost forever. They've also been working to restore the ancient water systems, which is important not just for historical reasons, but also for managing water in the region today.
So they're tackling this from all angles: archaeology, restoration, community work, environmental protection. It's a lot, but it sounds like they're making a real difference.
They are. And their work is super important because of the environmental issues Petra faces.
We talked about the general impact of too much tourism, but what are some of the specific environmental concerns at Petra? You mentioned flash floods, but what about all those people walking through the site every day?
Well, remember how most tourists follow that same path, down the spine of the site, hitting all the famous spots? All that foot traffic is actually wearing away the sandstone. It's like a slow motion erosion.
I never thought about it like that, but yeah, it makes sense. If that many people are walking the same path every day, it's bound to have an impact.
And then there's the carrying capacity issue. Studies say the site can only handle about 2,000 to 3,000 visitors at once before it gets seriously overcrowded.
Wait, so even though they had over 1 million visitors in 2019, that might have been way too many for the environment.
It's definitely possible. And the PDTRA has actually been trying to change how tourists move through the site. trying to steer them towards some of the other ruins that don't get as much traffic.
So spread the love a bit,
Hmm.
so to speak. But I'm also remembering Princess Dana's quote about modern development and flooding. How does that fit into all this?
That's where those ancient Nabatean water systems become super important again. See, the traditional buildings in the area were built with local materials and in ways that let water soak into the ground. But now, with all the modern development, there's a lot more concrete and other surfaces that block that natural absorption.
So more water is just running off instead of being absorbed, which makes flooding more likely.
Exactly. And remember, the PNT has been working for years to lessen the impact of flash floods, so this new development is kind of undoing their hard work. It's a perfect example of how short-term thinking can cause long-term problems.
It makes you think about how we define progress. Are we really moving forward if we build things that harm the environment and undermine the people trying to protect it?
That's a great point, and it applies to so many places around the world, not just Petra. We need to start thinking more holistically about development and realize that economic growth shouldn't come at the cost of the environment or our cultural heritage.
We've talked a lot about the problems, but what about solutions? Is there anything that can be done to balance tourism with protecting Petra?
There are definitely some ideas out there, and the PNT is looking into a lot of them, but one thing that stood out to me in the case study was their emphasis on learning from other organizations around the world that are dealing with similar issues.
That makes a lot of sense. Why start from scratch if someone else has already figured out a better way to do things?
Right. So, for example, the case study talks about the Siskaroli Tower in the Republic of Georgia. It was damaged in the Chechen War back in 2001. The International National Trust Organization is working with its members in Georgia and France to restore it. And one thing they're doing is using working holiday volunteers. Those volunteers help with the restoration, which not only provides labor, but also brings in some tourism money.
Oh, I like that. Tourists get a unique experience, and the site gets the resources it needs for preservation. Everybody wins.
Exactly. And they're also working with the local community to come up with new ecotourism opportunities. So it's not just about fixing the tower, it's about creating a more sustainable tourism model for the whole region.
This whole idea of learning from other places is really interesting.
Yeah.
What other examples does the case study mention?
Well, there's the National Trust for Jersey in the Channel Islands. They've been fighting against these development plans that would really mess up a gorgeous stretch of their coastline.
Yeah.
They managed to campaign and get the land that used to be for holiday camps returned back to nature, and they've been busy preserving old buildings in St. Helier, their capital, working with locals to raise money for restoration.
It's amazing how these groups are always at the forefront, pushing back against all that pressure to just build, build, build. Makes you think about all the places we've already lost or that are totally different now because those voices weren't loud enough.
Yeah, it makes you think, and it really shows how important it is to have groups like this speaking up for preservation, especially when so often it's all about the quick buck, not what's best in the long run.
Didn't the study mention some stuff happening in China too?
It did. They talk about Professor Ruan Yisan. He's an urban planner and a huge advocate for preserving heritage. He actually started China's very first heritage NGO, which is a member of INTO too.
Wow.
His work has been the key to saving a bunch of architectural treasures in and around Shanghai. But even there, he's running into those over-tourism issues, just like Petra.
It seems like we're always trying to find that balance, right?
Yeah.
Making these places accessible, but not letting them get ruined because too many people love them.
That's it, exactly. And it reminds us that there's no single answer that works everywhere. We got to keep adapting and finding new ways to handle tourism so it doesn't destroy the things we love. Actually, speaking of new stuff, the study brings up another problem a lot of these organizations are facing. Traditional volunteering is declining.
Yeah, I can see how that would be an issue.
Mhm.
So many of these groups rely on volunteers to get things done.
Big time. And it used to be that volunteers were mostly, retired folks or people with a lot of free time.
Right.
But things change. People are busier, or maybe they just don't want to commit to the traditional volunteer roles anymore. So groups like Intia are getting creative about how they get people involved. They're offering working holidays, combining travel with actual hands-on experience in conservation and preservation.
Oh, that's cool. So instead of just going on a regular vacation, you can spend some of your time actually doing something good for these places.
Exactly. It's a win-win. You get an amazing travel experience, and the site gets the help it desperately needs.
I love it. But what about groups that can't offer those kinds of travel experiences? How are they keeping up?
Well, over in the UK, the National Trust is trying out more flexible options. They're calling it visiteering and micro-volunteering.
Visiteering.
What's that? It's basically a way for people to lend a hand while they're already visiting a heritage site. Spend an hour or two doing some gardening, maybe help out with a tour, or even do a little project.
So it's like bite-sized volunteering,
Yeah.
something that fits into people's busy schedules.
Right. And it lets the National Trust get way more people involved, especially those who can't commit to a regular schedule.
Wow, we have covered so much today, from like ancient history to all the challenges they're facing now, and even some potential solutions. It's been amazing to see how it all connects. What's your biggest takeaway from all this?
For me, it's realizing that Petra is so much more than just a place on a travel bucket list. It's a real, living place with such a rich past, a complicated present, and a future that's kind of uncertain. It's a reminder that these places aren't frozen in time. They're dynamic, and what we do today as people, as a global community, has an impact for generations to come.
That's a powerful thought. It definitely makes me want to learn more about all this and how I can help make a difference.
That's the best we could hope for, right? I mean, ultimately, these sites belong to all of us, the whole of humanity. And it's our job to make sure they're still here for future generations.
Absolutely. So the next time you see that picture of the treasury at Petra, think about everything behind that beautiful facade. And hey, maybe think about supporting organizations like the Petra National Trust who are working so hard to protect it.
It's a responsibility we all share. Because what's the point of saving the past if we're not also making the future better?
Such a good point. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Petra. Until next time, keep exploring.